All right, EFF leader Julius Malema has raised the ire of many South Africans when he branded the majority of Indians racist. Now, the EFF leader went further on Monday, saying the truth about racism in the country is seen credible when being said by whites or Indians. Well, political analyst Professor Sipho, Seepe, and Michael Morris from the South African Institute of Race Relations joins us for more on this. Let's unpack it. Flo.
All right, well, we'll get back to our Skype call in a moment with Michael Morris. I do believe he is on the line. But let's start with you, Prof. Seepe. So the statement, let me just quote him correctly. So Julius Malema had said that the truth about racism is unacceptable when told by those of a lower class, is what he said. And I think part of what I was saying to you off air was I just have a problem with the lower class tag, because in essence, any black person can experience racism, whether you are of what's called a lower class or upper class, really.
Well, I think racism does not know any class.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to the United States, Obama himself, he says as a president, he's experienced racism. So those of us who even had led institutions, those of us who are in high places, will tell you that now and then you have to deal with racism. So it is not about a class issue. So that's the first thing that we must deal with. But what Malema was also trying to say is that when it is raised by white people or people who are not Africans, it seems acceptable to complain about the racism. But when it is raised by black people, it always appears to be self-serving, and people tend to doubt you. But if a white person were to say whites are racist, you won't see the barrage of criticism against that white person. So you find here Malema raising an important issue, but the response by what I may call thought police, because there are people in this country who have actually projected themselves as those who are going to determine what is to be discussed and not to be discussed. And here, after Malema had said that, people reminded them that actually a former judge of the Constitutional Court himself had said, as an Indian, he has, interacting with a number of Indians, he can say from his experience that almost 90% of Indians that he has come across are racist. But he didn't say all, and Malema's statement will say most.
Yes.
So, but what it does, it says, let us have a discussion about an important issue. There's a pretense in this country that we did not have the hierarchy of economic exclusion and oppression. And that's probably a debate that we should have. We cannot move forward to creating a non-racial, non-ethnic society until we deal with the ghosts of the past. And this is one of those. And part of it is because it has been very comfortable in this country to only talk about black and white without talking about the gradations of economic exclusion and oppression that existed.
Why do you think that in general it would have been more comfortable for the South African public to hear Zak Yacoob, a former Constitutional Court judge, saying that, yes, there are, I think his statement was that 90% of Indian people are racist in the country. Why was that more acceptable to hear? Because he didn't get into trouble, that's the truth. Why was it more acceptable to hear it from him than it was from Julius Malema? Do we have a problem? Are we a society that kind of rates people and decides that it's okay to hear this from you, but it's not okay to hear it from Flo? It's okay to hear something said by Professor Seepe, but we can't let Flo say it. Are we that kind of a society, that kind of, I think, classist sort of society?
Well, there are two elements to it. First of all, when you talk as a member of a grouping, and you speak from your experience, there's a certain degree of authenticity. But you must also give authenticity to also another element, a group that experiences a particular behavior, attitude towards itself. And they'll also be talking about authentic observation. And so both sides are authentic, but because it is Yacoob belonging to an Indian community,
right,
it gives that degree of authenticity. But also because he is also a former judge of a Constitutional Court. So there's an element of credibility that comes with the position that he has held. But what has happened is that there's been an attempt to silence this uncomfortable discussion, because South Africans would like to believe that we can wave a magic wand and suddenly the past ceased to exist, and as if there would not be a legacy of the past. So our history of dislocation, history of oppression, does affect how we see ourselves. And this is the discussion that the EFF is actually trying to put. But there's another element that some of us will raise, because if you go back, we who come from the black consciousness philosophy always talked about blacks in general. So effectively saying black is a state of mind towards oppression, that those who are opposed to oppression. And we're also recognizing that the Indians and the Coloureds did not define the hierarchies that were defined by apartheid, which was a strategy of divide and rule. Yes. So we talked about that we need to talk about those who are affected by oppression instead of talking about the gradations of oppression. But at the same time, we also said we recognize the hierarchies that had been created. This is why we talked in Liberation Speak about the liberation of black people in general and Africans in particular, because we understood that there is a hierarchy that had been created by the oppressor. And also that the majority of even today, when you talk about economic exclusion, you'll find that those who are affected are largely Africans. So if we're going to move forward, we cannot pretend that this reality does not exist.
All right, let's just bring in our, just go into Skype now, where Michael Morris is standing by, head of media at the South African Institute of Race Relationships. He joins us now via Skype. Mr. Michael Morris, thank you very much for joining us on Afro Breakfast.
Good morning.
All right, Michael, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining this discussion. It is getting heated in here. We wanted to know your opinion on the latest incidents that have been happening in Parliament, the statements by Julius Malema. What's your take on that and the whole spin on race?
Right. It's certainly, we absolutely agree with Professor Seepe that this is a vital debate, and it's important that South Africans engage in it. On the face of it, one might say that Julius Malema seems determined to be the bad boy of South African politics. But whatever his political objectives, we are concerned at the risks of this coming at a high cost, and essentially in squandering the huge reserves of goodwill in the country and the willingness of the vast majority of South Africans to work hard together to make the country succeed. Just looking at some of the detail, I think, is probably quite important. A great deal of attention has fallen on Justice Yaqub's comment, and I think the important distinction for us would be to look at his exact word. What he said was at least 90% of Indians that I come across are racist. So he's really defining quite a discrete quantity of opinion. It's people that he has come across, and that's very different from the very broad generalization of Julius Malema's earlier comment about people of Indian descent. And I think this highlights the essential problem. Generalizations are all as to have any point in a rational conversation, and yet they are blunt enough to cause a great deal of harm. And as I say, this squanders, a lot of goodwill and cooperative spirit in the country.
Mr. Michael Morris, are you saying that Malema's statement was an emotional statement rather than a factual statement?
I think it was such a broad generalization that our research has shown that this actually isn't borne out by poll results showing the sentiments of Indians. I think it's one thing to say that 90% of people that you've come across have displayed racist attitudes, but it's quite another to say that 90% of black people, Indian people, or white people have that sensibility. I think there's a distinction, and if we are going to have the important discussion that we need to have, we certainly think precision and civility and respecting people, not denigrating them on the basis of their race, is what's really important.
I'm going to ask Professor Seepe the same question, and Flo, you get involved as well. This issue of racism, why can't black people in South Africa be racist? Because I'm starting to see that you can only be racist if you're backed by power, economic opportunity, and some sort of a mental supremacy that comes from history. And speaking of the word history, we had our education minister trying to rewrite the history for our local school students. And Professor, I'll open that can of worms for you and let you deal with it. Can black people be racist, and why do white and Indian people have to be the mentally superior ones to be the proponents of racism? Why can't we be racist?
No, I think there's an issue of prejudice. And when that prejudice is backed by power, that means you are able to act on it. Black people, unfortunately, have no power economically, and they are therefore not able to carry out the prejudices that they may have. I think we're all prejudiced. I mean, in the same way that some of us have been prejudiced against the former president, some of us who are urban-based, who are highly educated, who are claim to be monogamous and all those things, and we believe in a different system, so we become prejudiced even amongst ourselves. But for me, that is a least of a problem. The problem is when you are able to carry out what you think. Remember, Martin Luther King says, I do not want that the government should make a white man to love me. But he says, I want the government to protect me from his hate. Because he understood full well that you cannot create a situation where government prescribe people that they should love each other. So, and we don't even like each other amongst ourselves as black people. So we should expect that there'll be an element of prejudice. It could be linguistic, it could be cultural, it could be racial and all that. So that is the reality.
Right.
But when you have power,
yes,
to effect your prejudice, that's where the problem is.
Right.
But what we need to do is to start talking about what type of society we want to create. And it starts also by accepting where we are. And that means that we must accept that we've had a history that has created a particular historical and psychological and ideological orientation. And unless we address that, we're not going to reach that ideal. So let us not shy away from discussing those uncomfortable issues. But for me, as a black person, I also think that we should worry less about what people do to us. We should start first by what is it that we can do to change the situation.
Correct.
Those of us who come from BC, we always said the less we talked about whites, the better for us, because we were locating the possibility of change within ourselves. I know black people who are white supremacists in a sense that they believe in whiteness. That if you were to have to select a black person and a white person for a position, they would rather instinctively choose a white person. So we have to address those issues amongst ourselves. So we have serious problems as black people before we start wanting other people to treat us differently. The reason why sometimes you are not taken seriously is because you don't take yourself seriously.
Correct.
So I think the challenge is also within the black community.
So, Professor, wouldn't you say that the central issue here is a lack of knowledge of self, and who is going to correct that? What institutions are there to teach South Africans about themselves, the values that they possess that other nations or other races will not teach about us? Do you understand? So where will that solution come from? Who will be our spokesperson? What institutions will be there in the future to teach black people about black people? But you may not have power now, but do you have to have a lack of knowledge of self?
Yeah, well, I think knowledge of self, knowledge of history. You need to understand that your conditions of poverty is not God directed, that it was a product of a particular history of subjugation of a number of years. So, and the economic reality ultimately determines how you relate. For instance, it is only in this country, or maybe in Africa, where you find that the white people who reside in this country do not have to learn your language because they're not there to serve you. You are there to serve them. So psychologically, you are part of the problem because you can't even speak your own language. If there's a meeting of about 500 people and there's one white person, black people will struggle to make sure that that white person understands them. But if you are in the midst of white people, they'll continue speaking irrespective of whether you understand them or not, because it is not their job to make themselves to be understood. It is your job to serve them and make yourself understood. And for as long as we are that psychologically damaged, we'll continue being treated the way Malema is complaining about. But what we should be saying is that the possibility of change lies with us. It does not lie with us trying to say, please treat us with respect. That has not worked. The reason why we are free today is when people stop the pleading. They simply said, let us deal with this issue ourselves.
All right, let me just wrap off by bringing in Michael Morris, and who's still on our Skype line. Michael, you know, do you believe? And I'm going to. I know this is quite a tricky one. I'm asking you as a white person to weigh in on this, but do you think there is a new sort of oppression that is linked to the economy? The fact is that for the most part, the black majority is working for companies that are owned and operated by the white minority, and so as a result, you have a situation where, if as a black person I speak up on issues about racism, and that there is racism in a particular company that I'm working for, that in some way you will get pushed out of that company. Why is that some kind of a new way of suppressing voices? Because obviously we can't have apartheid anymore, but there's a new way to economically sort of stifle you if you want to speak out about certain issues. Do you see that being something that is real and happening in this country?
We certainly feel that the primary problem in South Africa today is that we are still living with the consequences of the past, which is a massive division between, in very simplistic terms, the haves and the have-nots, and that this aligns far too closely still with race, and that is very much a consequence of the past. It's something that we need to address. But our feeling is that the way to address it, in fact, is in the economic sphere. Our empowerment policy, economic policy needs to be reformed in such a way that in fact it does make a difference. And after almost quarter of a century, we've not made sufficient progress. Empowerment doesn't reach nearly as deep into communities, and therefore that agency that you're referring to is that much weaker.
Yeah.
And we certainly believe it's just, all of society needs to have a stake in the economy, and at the moment that isn't there, and that is a primary issue.
All right. Thank you so very much, Michael, for joining us via our Skype line there. And, of course, Professor Seepe, our resident political analyst, weighing in on that statement by EFF leader Julius Malema, saying the truth about racism is unacceptable when told by those of a lower class. So that was the discussion then this morning. And we thank both our guests. Let's take a short break. Do stay with Afro Breakfast.